Hello, and thank you for joining us for our commentary on The Chosen. I'm Dr. Scott Hefelfinger, and I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Dr. Michael Barber, and we are both very blessed to serve on the faculty of the Graduate School of Theology. Here today, we're looking at episode 5, which is entitled The Wedding Gift. If you haven't caught our introduction to the series or the other episodes that we've commented on, I encourage you to check that out. In the intro especially, we talk about what we're doing, why we're doing it, how we're doing it. So if you're interested in our approach to The Chosen, please do view that episode, and you'll see us build that out in the subsequent episodes of commentary that we have. But again, today we're at episode 5, and it's called The Wedding Gift. And there's a kind of simplicity about this one that is really delightful, actually, where it's basically based on two biblical stories. The first one is the finding of the child Jesus in the temple in Luke's Gospel, chapter 2. And then we have a depiction of the wedding feast at Cana, which we find in John's Gospel, chapter 2. So these two scenes are really kind of at the heart of this episode. And so just to kind of kick us off, let's take a look at a clip that opens this episode.
Everywhere, day and night. We were so scared.
I told him, he's okay.
Why is everyone so upset?
Mary, he was in
You were supposed to be riding in the caravan with Uncle Abida.
I was supposed to be with my father.
Then why weren't you?
I was.
You were in the temple?
It was incredible, Mary. You should have seen him. He was teaching when I found him. The rabbis, the scribes, the scholars, they could not believe their ears. They barely let us leave.
Didn't you know I must be in my father's house?
It is too early for all this.
If not now, when?
Just help us get through all of this with you.
This was a very powerful scene for me for one particular reason, and that was the depiction of the temple. I've got to say, I've been studying this for a long time, Scott, and trying to imagine what it would be like to live in Jesus's time, to see the temple as it stood. And this isn't exactly how I imagine it, but I'll admit I got chills at that moment where Mary looks up and she sees the temple there. That was truly remarkable. But let's talk about the scene itself. That's more important. That is the interpretation of the biblical story. Here we have, of course, Jesus teaching in the temple, which foreshadows the work of his public ministry. Okay, I'm going to be honest. I was a little disappointed by this scene. I thought Mary was presented in a way that might be a little bit too forceful. I thought she protested a little bit too much in the scene in The Chosen. Mary says, it's too early for all of this. And then you can see she's processing this. She says, help us get through all of this with you, please, she says. And this is going to foreshadow the scene at the wedding feast at Cana.
Yeah, the first time I watched this, I will admit I was struck like you were about how almost hyperactive Mary is. Now, I mean, she's a parent who's lost her child. We would expect some of that, but it was kind of the anxiety that was there that threw me off. Coming back to watch it to prepare for this episode, maybe I was a little bit used to this side of Mary, and so I wasn't struck in that way. And as I was thinking about it, I went back to some images in sacred art, and it's kind of fascinating. You see both extremes. There are some images where Mary has this kind of sovereign, like, of course he was in the temple, look. And I don't know, I mean, that is one extreme. And then you have another extreme where she does have a little bit of a kind of pained or anxious expression. And I think what this gets at is that it's actually hard to depict what this would look like, precisely because Mary without sin, with complete trust in God, but not necessarily complete knowledge of God's plan, how would she have the proper care and, in a certain sense, the proper anxieties of a mother who's lost her child, after all, without not trusting in God. Like that's very delicate to try to present. And so I think you're right that it what's lacking, I think, is that we see the activity of Mary, but we have much less of a view of the contemplative side of Mary. And that for me was maybe the greatest lack.
Right. And I'll just be honest. I mean, this is my own take. You can look at various, Catholic representations of the story, various writings of different mystics, and we would talk about some of that later on, but which none of those writings are inspired or in any way inerrant, and they often contradict each other at key moments. But some of them actually do portray Mary as pretty distraught in this scene. So not just serene and at peace with what is happening here. The key element of the story, though, that stands out to me is the reflective dimension of Mary, at least as it's portrayed in the Gospel of Luke. So let's go to the Gospel of Luke. What happens in the Gospel of Luke? Jesus said to them, "Why were you looking for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" Now, this is accurately portrayed, I think, in The Chosen. And we read, "And they did not understand the saying that he spoke to them," which in a way actually is more unlike The Chosen. I mean, here Joseph's like, he's over there, you know what's going on here, which is kind of funny to me because Joseph is very talkative in The Chosen. I'm just going to say, I'm a little surprised by how many lines that actor got, because I'm sure when he read the original script, when he read the biblical stories, he must have been disappointed because Joseph never says anything in any of he never speaks in the Gospels. But what's interesting is if we go back to that slide there from Luke's Gospel, take a look. After Jesus' word, it says they did not understand the saying that he spoke to them. So after Jesus returns to his parents, after they're reunited, whatever that involved, they don't get it. And in The Chosen, they actually portray Joseph and Mary as getting more of it. Here's the thing that stands out to me. We read, "And he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was submissive to them." Here's the key line. "And his mother treasured up all these things in her heart." Now, in Luke's Gospel, she does that treasuring up, it seems, as they're in Nazareth, right? Not at the moment of being reunited with Jesus. That being said, we talked about Peter's character. We've talked about Matthew's character. When I think about Mary, I think of this more contemplative dimension of her character, at least in the Gospel of Luke. And it doesn't seem like there's a lot there. It seems that she's trying to tell Jesus, I'm not ready for this yet. Maybe that's the way it went down. I don't know. But it is that contemplative dimension that I would have liked to see a little bit more of in the episode.
Yeah, and I mean, that too, it is a difficult balance. I'm thinking of St. Teresa of Avila has a beautiful commentary on Martha and Mary. And she sort of says, look, the ideal is to bring both of them together. And so if we think of cloistered contemplative life on the one hand, and then a more active life of service on the other hand, we should expect them to both be present in perfection.
Right. Martha and Mary being not Mary, the mother of God, but Mary and Martha, Jesus' friends at Bethany.
Exactly.
The relatives of Lazarus.
Right. And
Lazarus.
And we should expect these to be brought together in Mary.
Right.
And so it's not that it's wrong to have Mary, exercising activity and service, as we're going to see later in the episode. And we wouldn't want to see her as just sort of otherworldly. All she's doing is sort of like reflecting interiorly.
Right.
So it's really a delicate balance.
And I appreciate the way that they portray Mary as trying to work this out, even as she's talking to Jesus. Clearly in Luke's Gospel, she does not understand. Mary is not all-knowing, right? And sometimes you do get that portrayal in Catholic imagination or various Catholic sources. Well, Mary got everything. At the moment of the birth of Jesus, for example, in one source, it's not biblical, but in a private revelation, Mary gets everything at the birth of Jesus, and she sees it all. Well, that doesn't really fit with what we see in the Gospel of Luke, and this is why the church doesn't require us to accept private revelations. which are typically not written down by the people who had the revelations themselves. So there's often a distance there between the saint and the writings too. So, all right, well, but I do want to say I did appreciate much of this episode. There was a scene I really liked. It's where the disciples are on their way with Jesus to the wedding feast at Cana. Let's take a look at this clip, and then we've got some thoughts on that.
I know that look.
I'm sorry.
Yes, son.
I was thinking, if this wedding is worth a journey for you, who has so much to do, perhaps it is also worth the journey for many wealthy Jews.
You believe important and powerful Hebrews will be there.
Possibly.
I'm very keen, son. The most important and powerful person I know will be there.
Oh, yeah?
My mother.
Isn't your mother from Nazareth?
Can anything good come from Nazareth? That's what Nathaniel says in John's gospel, in the beginning of John's gospel. That's just one line in the gospel, but you pointed out to me, they're really milking that one.
I found it so funny. It's like this recurring background joke, which it could have been, and so it's very amusing, but it is, there's the one spot where it comes out. But here, right, we have Jesus saying, the most important and powerful person I know is my mother. And this sort of frames in many ways the episode. And so one of the things that I was thinking about is how much this episode shows Mary as a woman of prayer and as someone who teaches us something about prayer and petitioning God for things. And so I think we'll see that come out. But here, I mean, this is a very Marian kind of approach that they're taking.
Yeah, that was very interesting. And of course, when we go back to the Gospel of John, we see the wedding feast of Cana depicted, and I was surprised in a certain sense by the way it was portrayed, and pleasantly surprised. So if you go to the Gospel of John, let's take a look at a slide here from John 2. We read the story when the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to Jesus, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." And we'll come back to this slide. Let's talk about this line for a second. "Woman, what does this have to do with me?" That is a line that many people have seen as a sign of Jesus' disrespect for Mary.
Right.
You'll actually see this in study Bibles. They have to spend time in the study Bible dealing with this issue of, did Jesus break the fourth commandment by calling his mother woman?
Right, or if not disrespect, at least sort of trying to put her in her place, right?
Right.
But it's not really what's going on here.
That's certainly not what's going on here. We could say a lot about this passage. There's so much rich reflection on passages in the Gospel of John. What many people have pointed out is that John opens with creation themes, right? So in the beginning, a direct echo of Genesis. And there are many other creation themes throughout chapter 1. So when Jesus refers to his mother as woman, people have identified here perhaps a new Eve imagery, right? Because how does the creation narrative reach its climax? Well, in Genesis, God creates Adam and Eve, but if you read it all together, both accounts of creation together, we read that God creates Adam first, and then there's the passing of the night, and then there's Eve. So it seems like at the end of this creation week, we have a wedding, right? We have a marriage. And so many people have seen similar imagery here. What is important is in this particular episode, we see Mary playing an intercessory role that really draws from what we see in the Gospel of John. Let's go back to that Bible verse we had up a second ago. After Jesus says, "My hour has not yet come," we read, his mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." So we don't see here Mary say, "If not now, when?" echoing the scene of the presentation in The Chosen. But there does seem to be a kind of intercession going on here. Right?
Yeah, and I mean, so you pointed out that they don't use woman. Jesus addresses her as mother.
That's right, yeah.
And this is, I mean, not only, obviously throughout The Chosen, they're going for a very kind of, in some ways, human portrayal of Jesus, and I appreciate that. Some things are missed, right? We talked in our intro episode how presentations are always obscure and reveal. And so what's obscured by changing that is Mary as the new Eve, right? Possibly. But what is revealed is this interpersonal character. And I think even more importantly, Mary's maternal intercession, right? And so what we see depicted here is a kind of idea of petitionary prayer. And this is why it's true that we don't find in the Gospels Mary pleading so much. If not now, when? Please. And it's very moving. I found it very moving when I watched it. But I think by adding that, which is not in the biblical story, some things are lost, but I think what is gained is that we see more clearly that Mary can teach us something about petitionary prayer.
That's
because in the Gospel account, she simply states they have no wine.
Right.
And I think this shows a kind of, a manifest trust in her son. And there's a beauty and fullness to that. But by having her plead in this way, it makes more clear that she's asking for something. And there are plenty of biblical precedents, right, for petitionary prayer. We can go all the way back to Abraham, who's, negotiating with God almost, about saving the righteous in Sodom. And I think one thing to see is that when we petition God for things, St. Augustine points out, we shouldn't think of this as like, oh, we're going to change God's mind. No, he's God, first of all. He knows all things, and he's all-powerful. But what prayer does is, first of all, it begins to change our own hearts so that we can welcome his gift and his answer, which is what Augustine says. But even if prayer doesn't change God's mind, it can still be efficacious. And this is one of the mysteries and fascinating dimensions of prayer, that God ordains to work things out through our prayers. Not as if he's like, oh, I'm going to change my plan because someone prayed, but we forget that God is the one who actually inspires prayer. And so he moves us to pray for things, and then he grants those things in accord with our prayers. And so we sort of see this come out, I think, in a helpful way by, upping Mary's activity, by changing her words to plead with Jesus. We see a model of her intercessory prayer, not only in this scene, but also for us as our maternal heavenly intercessor, I think.
Yeah, what I like about the Bible is that Mary just presents the need to Jesus. She doesn't direct Jesus as to what to do. And in a way, that's a model for all of us, right? We understand that God already knows what's best. We don't need to give him a clue as to how we should address our problems. But at the same time, God wants us to come to him with our problems. As we read in 1 Peter, cast your cares upon Christ, for he cares for you. And so we do cast our cares upon Christ. And so what I like in the biblical account is the way Mary simply brings the need to Jesus. Now, if we were to read the Gospel of John as a biblical book, so not just as a standalone book, but as part of the larger Bible, what we recognize is we read John with Luke, right? There are two Gospels here. And in the fourfold canon, the church always reads these books together, we see something that's interesting. In the Gospel of Luke, Simeon reveals to Mary that because of her son, a sword will pass through her own soul. My friend Edward Sri, who's an expert in Mary and Scripture, points out that gives us an interesting backdrop for this scene here at the wedding feast of Cana. In other words, Mary says they have no wine. Jesus says to her, my time has not yet come. But if you're reading this, having already read Luke's gospel in the canon, what Jesus is saying is, in a sense, you realize what you're asking for here, right? It's not just going to be all rainbows and rabbits and, bunny rabbits. This is going to involve suffering. My hour has not yet come. His mother then says, do whatever he tells you. So Mary recognizes Jesus performing a miracle here is going to involve bringing about the hastening of his hour. And she is ready. She says, do whatever he tells you. And I like it, do whatever he tells you, because she doesn't know what he's going to do. Now, what I do like about the chosen portrayal is, in a similar way, they bring together Luke and John. And of course, in the story of the finding of Jesus in the temple, in the story, did I say presentation earlier? In the story of the finding of Jesus in the temple, in their portrayal, Mary says to Jesus, it's all too soon, right? This is not the right time, right? And she says to him, please, let me work through this with you. And now, in the chosen portrayal, Mary is essentially saying, I'm ready for this.
Yeah, and I mean, what I really liked about how this all comes together is what's clear is that in John's gospel, here in chapter 2, the wedding at Cana, this is a transitional moment in the gospel.
Sure.
Because we have the beginning of Jesus's performing of signs so that people start to believe. But as you pointed out, it also looks towards in a way, the ultimate, most painful sign of Jesus's death on the cross. And so that's also hinted at in the depiction here. And even we have a sense that his disciples are beginning to have a clue about this. We have a clip.
Yes.
Let's take a look at this clip, which shows a little bit of this discussion.
Great.
What then, man?
It's not proper to say in front of a woman.
I have seen and heard things that would turn your blood to ice.
A latrine? Wait, ice?
Yes.
Our master building a privy.
A job is a job. I was cutting stone for the retaining wall. He was building a ramp of cedar planks so the crippled and the elderly could get to it without climbing the steep stairs.
But why didn't he heal them so they could mount the steps themselves?
He's always saying his time has not yet come.
Calling your name, the catch of the fish. Why was it his time for miracles then and not others?
Because those were private. He hasn't shown his signs to others publicly yet.
What's keeping him from making his ministry public?
The wind blows to the south or to the east, and you cannot say why.
A latrine. Yeah, we better not spread that around.
He doesn't hide where he's from.
Oh, don't tell Andrew. That will... Yeah, he'll be surprised.
So as they're talking to each other and having this chat, what comes out is they're beginning to think through that Jesus has performed some miracles, but privately, and maybe in time there will be a kind of public manifestation. But that's exactly what's going on here. And Thaddeus there, who's the stone worker, a little later on, captures this in a remarkable way too. When Jesus is looking at these stone jars filled with water that are about to be transformed into wine, Thaddeus is describing how stonework is very final. Once you change something, there's no going back. Unlike working with metal, where you can put it back in the fire, soften it up, fix something. There's a kind of fixity to working with stone. And the implication, as they put this together in a really creative depiction, is that as Jesus begins to manifest himself publicly here, that's going to set the course of his public ministry. That's going to send him, so to speak, down the path to the cross. And it all ties together here in connection with Mary's intercession.
And what I really liked about this was the distinction made between his public miracles or his public ministry and what he's doing in private.
Yeah.
There is a constant motif, especially noted in the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus is telling people not to tell others about his miracle. It's often referred to as the messianic secret, right? That Jesus wants to keep his identity as the Messiah under wraps. I don't really know if it's the messianic secret. I think it's more of the theme of Jesus as the Son of God, which is certainly related. But anyway, one of the ways people have dealt with this is they've recognized, well, Jesus says things to the disciples in private, while at the same time not wanting the message to get out publicly about everything that he's about to do, everything that he is, because once that becomes known, well, certain sort of events are going to unfold. Oh, bring to an end his public ministry. But what I'd like to do here is go to another clip now where we see Jesus. In the last clip, we saw Jesus and the disciples talking, Peter. A lot of humor in this, right? Where Peter's like, don't tell Andrew about this. You know? I thought that was great. I love Andrew so much. Andrew's such an interesting character to me, the brother of Jesus. You know, James and John always get to do stuff together with Peter, and it's always Peter, James, and John. And I always wonder, how would Andrew feel? You know, he's kind of like the fourth wheel or something like that, you know, left out. But let's look at another scene here where we do see the issue of two Jameses. Take a look at the clip.
Thank you, James.
Yes, master?
Two Jameses. How will we solve this dilemma?
Well, what if I go by Big James?
Is that acceptable to you, young James?
Yes, I think that's fair, master.
The sense of justice, too, huh? Then it's settled. Now, to the road, my friends. The bride and groom await.
Did I say Andrew, the brother of Jesus, before that clip? I think I meant, of course, Andrew, the brother of Peter, not Andrew.
That's why he would feel left out. If
That's
it's
why
always Peter, James, and John.
Right.
It's like, well, poor Andrew.
Right. Peter didn't get to bring his brother along up to the Mount of Transfiguration.
Right.
Well,
But we did want to talk
later.
about brothers of Jesus.
That's right. So we do have, actually, that's right. So I was getting ahead of myself. So we have two Jameses here. It's interesting that in the episode, we hear a reference to the fact that Jesus has brothers, but I just wanted to point out that I thought it was strange that they didn't mention a possible reading that would imply that James is himself one of the brothers of Jesus. So if we take a look at the list of the apostles in Matthew chapter 10, we recognize that there are two Jameses, right? We see the name of the 12 first, Simon. Simon comes first. And not because he's the one who's called first, which is interesting. But we have James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew, the tax collector, James, the son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanian, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Well, I want to talk about this for a second here. Here we have two Jameses. We see that portrayed in The Chosen. Why is this James significant here? Well, who is this James the Younger, as he's called in the episode? Little James, is that the Big James and Little James?
Big James and Little James.
Yeah. So who is this Little James? Well, we can go back and we can see this title actually comes from the Gospels themselves. We read in Mark, for example, 15 about James the Younger. We read, and there were also women looking from a distance at the crucifixion scene, among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James the Younger and of Joseph, and Salome, who, when he was in Galilee, followed him and ministered to him, and many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. Now, who is this James the Younger? Isn't that interesting that the way Mark identifies this other Mary is by saying, oh yeah, that's Mary, the mother of James the Younger. Well, it would seem like Mark would expect the reader to know who this James is. And in fact, we read earlier in the gospel about James and Joseph. So this is not the first time we read about James and Joseph. In Mark chapter 6, they say, is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon, and are not his sisters here with us? Now, of course, in non-Catholic Christian circles, it's typically understood Jesus has other blood brothers and maybe sisters from Mary. And so it's understood that the brothers of Jesus are actually the other children of Mary. This is not, however, the way ancient Christians understood this. If we go back to the early church, we already mentioned a line from Origen, where Origen says, well, those who think properly about Mary understand that these are not the children of Mary. Well, how can we say that? Well, the Greek word for brother can also mean like cousin or relative. Jerome, the early Bible scholar of the church who translated the Bible from Greek into Latin, explained this. So this whole idea that Jesus didn't have blood brothers and sisters through Mary is not some like newfangled idea. It's not even from the Middle Ages. This is something that came up very early on, right? In the early church, as early as Origin. Jerome is writing against a guy named Helvidius. Helvidius claimed that Jesus had blood brothers, blood relatives, blood siblings through Mary, right? And Jerome says, no, that's not the case. He says, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, was not the same person as the Lord's mother. So when we see that scene of the crucifixion, right? When we go back to that scene of the crucifixion, and let's see here, we can go back to the slide here. When we go back to that slide, we see the women that are there at the cross, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James the younger and of Joseph. Is that Mary, the mother of Jesus? Is that the way you'd identify the mother of Jesus and say, yeah, this is Mary, the mother of these other two kids? You remember them? They're from earlier in the gospel. It would be a very peculiar way to identify Mary, right? And what Jerome recognized is that brothers can often mean like a close relative.
Right. And we see this elsewhere in Scripture, right? Where brother is used to refer to a cousin or some other close relative.
So the Greek word is adelphos. Mm-hmm. So my favorite example of this is found in the Greek version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, in Genesis chapter 13. So if we go back to Genesis 13 there on the slide, we read, so then Abraham said to Lot, who's his nephew, okay, let there not be strife between you and me and between your herders and my herders, for we are adelphoi. We are brothers, right? But they're not actually blood brothers. But nobody would have had this problem. My friends who are from Africa always find this amusing because in Africa, brother doesn't just mean the child from your mother. It can also refer to cousins. So this is a uniquely Western idea. Brothers have to just mean, blood brothers. And as early as Jerome, this was understood. We can also go to Origin. Let's just look at that one line from Origin I mentioned earlier. This is back on the slide, Origin. For if Mary had no other son except Jesus, in accordance with those who hold a sound opinion of her, where does he get this idea? Well, in the Gospel of Mark, James and Joseph are presented as the brothers of Jesus. And yet, in Mark's Passion narrative, they're children of a different Mary. And so the two people who are explicitly first called the brothers of Jesus are also very unlikely to also be the children of Mary, it would seem. And so this is why Christian tradition has a hard time. So who is this James, the other James that we read about in the story? Little James seems to be a relative of Jesus. Some people wonder if this is the same figure who's identified as the son of Alphaeus. Mm-hmm. Some people wonder if that's the same person. And there's some evidence in the Gospel of John, too. There's these women at the cross, and one of them is Mary, the mother of Jesus, but then Mary is there with her sister, who's also called Mary. Well, wait a minute. Mary's probably, it's not like George Foreman, right? George Foreman had all his children named George and Georgina, right? Probably didn't work that way. Even though Miriam was a common name, probably when it says Miriam or Mary, Mary's sister, it means her cousin. And so it seems that you could correlate these things. That's how the early church fathers often did it. And that's why they thought the brothers of Jesus were the cousins of Jesus, not the sons of Mary. And one other last thing. In the book of James, we have James stand up in Acts 15. He's the head of the church in Jerusalem. He's got some prominence. Who is this guy? Well, people will say, well, this is the man who's also called the brother of Jesus. Is he also one of the apostles? Well, the only other James that's mentioned is James the Greater, who dies in Acts chapter 12. So it can't be James the son of Zebedee, right? The other James has to be the other James, and he's mentioned in Acts chapter 1. So perhaps the book of Acts is combining all these characters together. But anyway, we just thought we should point this out because here we have the identity of some of these guys discussed. And so I just wanted to add it from a Catholic perspective, how this has typically been understood. And again, it's rooted in exegesis of Scripture, not just some pious legends or something like that.
Yeah, and this is just some good, we hope good and helpful background information as you see these characters introduced. And if we're hoping that we're all going back to Scripture to reflect on this. And if we see, James and brother of Jesus,
right.
This is just to give a sense of the biblical picture and how it's been interpreted in the tradition.
Right. Ancient, right? This is very ancient. All right, so we could talk about some other things here. One of the fascinating aspects of this episode to me was that Peter acknowledges that it's very unusual for the teacher to choose the students. And from what we know about ancient Jewish rabbis, it was the students who chose the rabbi, not the other way around. So I appreciated that got right. They got other things wrong, though. John the Baptist is arrested by the Romans. But in the biblical narrative, he's actually arrested by Herod.
Yeah.
So Herod is not a Roman. So we have to understand that. And he's probably not sending out the Roman soldiers, right? He's not commanding Roman soldiers. We also have the reference to Bethsaida. Here I've got a photo of Bethsaida. I appreciated the mention of Thaddeus. He talks about how he was building a latrine there. One thing that's not mentioned in The Chosen, maybe it'll come out later, according to the Gospel of John, that was Peter and Andrew's hometown. So we don't really know how they came to Capernaum. There are lots of interesting ways to speculate about that. We'll see what The Chosen has to say, and maybe we'll comment on that later. I was a little bit surprised later on where we read about Thaddeus, and he was emphasizing this whole idea of the distinction between stonemasons and smiths. You don't see that in the gospel narrative. I was pleasantly surprised, though, for the reasons that you mentioned. I like the way it emphasizes being a stonemason or being a tectone, right? It's a lot different than being a person who could just put the iron back in the fire and recraft it.
It's actually, that point I thought the kind of point of departure where that story unravels from or unfolds from are these 6 stone jars for the purification waters. This is actually, a really remarkable kind of lectio on a very particular detail in the Gospel of John, right? Stone jars. And there's something actually very patristic about this, where the fathers will often zero in, and come up with a really fruitful meditation on
same
the
method.
stone.
Not the same
type
conclusion,
of method.
but the same kind of method, right?
That's right.
And you mentioned the stone jars. There, of course, Thomas in The Chosen is prominent. Thomas is the wine merchant who has to deal with the situation of them running out of wine. And of course, then he witnesses the miracle that Jesus performs. This raises trouble for him. He's presented as a planner, a careful organizer. Let's take a look at the last clip we have here.
That should be it for the night. Who is he? I can't pretend I didn't see a miracle. He gave us even more than we need.
He invited me to join him. He wants us to meet him in Samaria in 12 days.
Samaria.
I don't know what to think.
So don't. Maybe for once in your life, don't think.
Don't think.
Cringe. Cringe, as the kids say these days. Yeah, that was part of the episode that I really didn't like. Now, I will say they were very careful to present Jesus as saying it's good to ask questions. And Jesus isn't the one who says, don't think.
Right. And you have to, in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is teaching that, who, he talks about the one building the tower and the king going out to battle.
Yep.
You've got to think and plan beforehand.
Yes.
Right? So it's a little bit incongruous in a certain way. There's some tension there, right? But I think maybe to go back to one of our other discussions about being childlike, it's possible to overplan and to not have trust, right? To not remain simple.
That's right.
And that is, I guess, what they're getting at. But it was a little hard for us to hear just the kind of like, implying basically don't plan, don't think, just, well, what? I don't know, feel or,
Yeah, this
little
constant,
cringeworthy there.
this kind of trope of the head versus the heart, which I always find troubling and very out of sync with what we know about first century Jewish thought and practice. Of course, we've seen Jesus explain that we need to study, that we need to know, for example, things like the Shema. And I appreciated that it's Thomas's business partner. I don't know how to describe this woman in the scene. You got a better description for her?
They're coworkers at this point.
Co-workers, yeah. Interesting to see how they laid that out. It's on her lips that we hear don't think. Clearly, the chosen wants us, the chosen producers, not the chosen one, but the chosen producers want us to think. They want us to go back to the scriptures, as they've said. And we hope that this episode has caused you to want to go back and look more carefully at the story of the finding of Jesus in the temple and the wedding feast at Cana, the identity of the disciples. And of course, it's in that kind of careful, prayerful study that we're going to come to a deeper love for the scripture text and ultimately for Jesus Christ himself.
And so we hope this episode will help you to do that. Thank you so much for spending this time with us, and thank you for joining us as we continue through our commentary.
And please be sure to tell others about this commentary and invite others to take a look at this if they're watching The Chosen. Here's another resource that they might find helpful. Till next time, may God bless your study of his word.